How's it going, everybody? This is Trey Bell. I'm with Jonathan Critford, and this is Arcane Frequencies. We are back with the Foetus video, or all the different variations of their names, scraping fetus off the wheel. Uh,
You've
you
got
got
Foetus
fetus
on your
on your
breath.
breath. Uh, I know there's fetus interrupts. Yeah, like this is a very interesting listen, and well, I'll let Jonathan introduce them because like he knows more about them than I do. But
I mean, it's an artist that, or I should say, Jim Thirwell, is an artist that I don't think it's ever really possible to know a lot about because he has done so many different things over the years, collaborated with so many people. Um, and in actual fact, I think until I spoke about this in our last video, until Cathy Unsworth's Season of the Witch, The Book of Goth came out, I don't think I realised that he was Australian. He's from Melbourne. Um, as were the birthday party with Nick Cave and Warren Ellis and other people. Not Warren Ellis, Mick Harvey. There'll be somebody in the comments already saying Warren Ellis was in the bad seeds. I know that. Um, but yeah, Jim has really kind of always been something of an enigma, and I don't think you can ever quite pin down what his next move was ever going to be. He's also known as he's a big collaborator. Like I said, he's been known as Clint Ruin. You know, when he worked with Coil, we talked about that last time. Frank Want as well, when he's done stuff with Nurse with Wound, who we've mentioned before. He's worked with Mark Arman from Soft Cell when he did his Mark and the Mambas project, which is incredible. They released an incredible string of albums. And with Foetus and kind of the records that we're going to be talking about today, it really comes down to Trey and I were talking before we started recording about how if you can actually play an instrument, it's um, much easier for you to subconsciously or consciously copy other music that you hear. And Fetus kind of speaks to the punk aesthetic of, you don't have to be able to play anything to make music. Um, and I think the punk era, short lived as it was, I mean, there are people who will argue that it was already over by 1977. And kind of the post punk era kicked off, I would argue, little aside here, I would argue with Wire's first album, Pink Flag. A lot of people would look at John Lydon's post Sex Pistols project, Public Image Limited. I disagree with that, but that's a story for another day. But the post punk era kicked off this idea of people looking round in the wake of punk and thinking, well, now what do we do? The Pistols had imploded, and the bands from the New York punk scene, the Ramones, they kind of started going around the world, and the scenes that were kind of so heavily publicized in their cities, so New York and London, I suppose, being the two big ones, that was it. They were over. They were over as soon as they started, it felt like. And so people were then looking around, not quite sure what they were going to do next. And Jim Thirlwell has, for my mind, the best quote in the book that I've just mentioned, Season of the Witch, which is, if punk was the Big Bang, post-punk and goth were the expansions of the universe. And I think, given the type of music that he would end up making, I think that's a great and rather uh, prescient quote, because industrial music and that whole thing, we talked about Current 93 before, Coil, etc., that all comes from this. It's people who took the punk attitude but wanted to do things a little bit differently, experiment with electronics, found sound, and yeah, just a completely unique approach for the time to recording.
so so for me, I'll start off my introduction into Foetus. actually kind of goes again, like constant theme on this channel. I'm always usually bringing up Current 93 because that band is where I found a lot of these other bands. So like I'm probably always gonna like bring them up, but specifically when I was researching Current 93 back in the day when I was in college around like I want to say the 2015 era of my life, 2016. I remember like wanting to try to find interviews of them in which are very rare. They're very
Yeah,
hard to find, and luckily I was able to find like a probably one of the earliest like Current 93 interviews, which was actually like a compilation of interviews of other artists, which at the time, other than Current 93, I didn't know of, but now I do know is was Coil. It was another band, but I forgot the name, and Foetus. But the one thing that like kind of struck me about Foetus was just like seeing David Tibet, Koyo, that other band, they kind of have that like beatnik type of like aesthetic
yeah.
personality like trait. But like I was just looking at like Jim Thirwell and just being like, why does he look like someone off the Breakfast Club or something? Like he looks like the traditional like 80s like
Yeah,
kind of like greaser hair type of person. Like it confused me because and I remember hearing like a song, like I guess like in the interview they were playing like one of his songs, and I'm just like, this is again, I was still getting used to listening to weirder stuff and like more avant-garde stuff. But I'm like, this is very particular. His
yeah,
look is very particular, and that's interesting. I'm gonna have to listen to that at some point in my life. And, fast forward maybe like 6, 7 years later, like I've listened to all of the first five like Foetus albums, like in all their variations of different names that Jim Thirwell had called himself, like always using involving the word fetus, which at the time I did not know how to pronounce it. I was like, it's the same Foetus
yeah,
because like in America, like we spell fetus a different way. So I was
yeah,
just like, I was like, what Foetus? Like, what does that mean? But no, I guess like because I've only like when we before we did this video, like I actually end up listening to a bunch of the first five Fetus albums, like about maybe 3 months ago, I want to say, maybe 2 months, I can't remember. And I was on a streak of like listening to like as much of like these artists that we've been talking about as of late, and
yeah,
I just kind of fell off. I kind of got back into just like listening to like my main comfort stuff, and a lot of stuff has been going on in the music like industry lately that just like have been grabbing my attention. So doing research kind of just like went off. So I've only listened to each of these albums once, but the one thing I have a bunch of quote like notes that I've made. Well, not a bunch, just like I made like a note based off of each album how it made me feel. So I'll start off with I'm gonna give these examples, and then I'll let you take it and run with it because there's not much that I can talk about since I've only like listened to each album once. So like I don't really think there's a lot to dive deep into. It seems like he has like a standard type of sound that like doesn't need to that much, because like a lot of the songs sound like, your average song, just with like how you said there's a lot of craziness just going on in the back.
yeah. I think it's worth mentioning at this point, actually, that I know that there's from the interview he did for Kathy Unsworth's Season of the Witch book. Um, he mentioned this love from when he started getting into music of making tapes, and you know, learning how to manipulate tapes on kind of early primitive recordings and learn how to loop and all of those kinds of things. And so I think he was always more interested in what he could do with, uh, you know, non-traditional approaches as opposed to being a songwriter. And obviously there are Fetus albums. Nail is the one that always comes to mind for me, where he's able to get the balance of that very well. Um, and he actually did appear on a program in the UK called The Tube in 1985, where he played a few songs I believe from that album, using loops and a few other things. And basically, he did it on his own. But there are tinges of melody in there, which I think to begin with, I don't think you could say were there. Because the other thing I'll say as well is that the image of those records back then were great. You know, the kind of the comic strip
Yeah.
sleeves, and um, he was on Some Bizarre Records back then, and Steve Pierce, who ran Some Bizarre Records, just seemed to he had a real knack for picking bands that were all very different but shared this kind of common trait of willing to go to the nth degree for their music. And yeah, great stuff. So sorry, Trey, I'll let you.
Oh no, you're
Uh,
good.
no, I was going to say,
Um,
let's go in. So Deaf is the
yeah,
first
Def.
album to talk about, and that is under You've Got Your Fetus on Your Breath. You've Got Fetus on Your Breath, sorry. So 1981 for this first one.
Yeah, so the way that I would describe like this particular album was just chaotic, isolated sounds.
Yeah,
And that's like it's like it sounds like I'm listening to it's like I'm observing someone play music in a room by themselves, like in the dark. And it's like they have a bunch of different instruments or just anything that they can make a sound with, and somehow are just playing these all like, together in a certain pattern that's like it's like it's very minimal, but the chaoticness also makes it feel like there's so much going on at the same
yeah,
time. Like
yeah,
it's like a feeling I can't properly describe. That's like why I said like chaotic, isolated sounds. It's like these sounds are doing their own thing, but they just happen to just be playing as like other stuff are doing their own thing. And I don't know. I really don't know how to expound on that. It's just like I don't know. It just sounds like someone who's just like wailing at stuff. Like it's like it's they're your neighbor, and you're just hearing like all these crazy sounds that they're making, and just like these guttural like
yeah,
yelps that like emulate like the essence of like pop songs during the 80s.
yeah, exactly. And I think that that I think is probably what he would have wanted. I don't know, but he. The other thing I think, listening to these records again, that I maybe didn't pick up on before is that the sense of humor that runs throughout this.
Yeah.
Some of the backing kind of group vocals on these songs are hilarious. You
Yeah, that was
know.
the one thing I noticed about them too when I first had like even like when I saw the interview of him like in that compilation of like different artists, like there was definitely a certain sense of humor I could tell that this dude had because I'm like I'm like this dude seems like serious but not serious at the same time.
Yeah, and I think like it's really interesting the way you phrase that about, you know, it is the sound of somebody kind of doing a lot of stuff on their own, because I think he was, like I said, the way he kind of got into music, he started off making tapes and things like that. Um and he, being from Melbourne, was uh familiar with the birthday party, and I believe he knew the birthday party as well, um, who were one of the earliest proponents of what I suppose you would call post-punk music, but they were, they effectively wrote murder ballads. Really, they had this kind of bluesy bent to them, but were so chaotic and so nihilistic in a way. Um, and then at the same time, I know he went and saw Einstürzende Neubauten, who, a bit like other bands we could mention, were obviously huge pioneers of industrial music, and I don't think anybody had. And the idea of using just anything, you know, a like a bin lid or kitchen utensils, anything that made a sound, they would use and try and incorporate somehow. And then somebody like Jim Thirlwell comes along and tries to sort of combine those things. Like, can I make songs in inverted commas while can I make songs with all of this other racket going on at the same time? Because there are bits that you can hear melody in there, um, but it's almost as I know certainly in those early days he had this thing of if I come up with something catchy, I need to make it go away. So he would add all of these crazy other things in there. And it is like listening to. I'd not listened to Def in a long time, actually. Um, and it does completely split your head open because there are these really strange elements of almost sort of sleazy swing jazz at times. There's piano in there, but then there's this absolutely deafening noise that will come in. Screeching and out of tune, everything. Um, but he, I don't know what it is. He has this way of taking all of these elements and somehow you can't help but listen to it. Um, and yeah, I've got to say, of the albums I re-listened to for this, I think Death is definitely the sound of somebody still trying to work out
Yeah.
what it is they wanted to do.
Yeah, that was my first impression, like listening, because like again, with most of the bands that we and artists that we talk about, like starting from like their first stuff to like where they're at now, this does sound like he was really just trying to experiment. Like this, if anything, this is the true essence of what experimental music
Yeah,
is,
absolutely.
and building off of just like this first seed being planted. Because like as I was listening to it, like I'm like, it's not really anything that's sticking out to me song wise, like in my opinion. Like I mean, obviously because there's so many things sticking out all at once that
Yeah,
like it just kind of all melds together. And I'm just like, I'm just trying to adjust to like what in the hell this is just in the first place. Because, you know, from all the experimental music that I've listened to, I can definitely make nods or like be like, oh yeah, this sounds similar to this sounds similar to that. But at the same time, like when it comes to the core essence of what Jim Thirlwell's sound is, it's like something I have never heard before, and something that really does feel like what it would have been of its time when he was like starting out making this stuff. Because like I mentioned, like it sounds like you know an '80s pop artist who's gone mad.
absolutely. I think that's the best way to describe it because obviously there are sort of quasi funk elements to some of these things that was obviously very funk was used and abused in the 80s in pop, especially here in the UK with bands like ABC and Duran Duran, and it does. That's probably the best description I can think of. That, like you said, it is a pop artist who's gone mad. I mean, in terms of songs that stick out, "Why Can't It Happen to Me" does have. There's a melody in there that is. It's pretty damn catchy. Um, you know, it's beneath. If you can clear away all the mess in that song, there is a really well written melody under there. Um, but like I said earlier, it's almost as if the moment a melody emerges, he wants to take it away from you. And I think that there's almost like a scatological, um,
Yeah, that's a good way to.
real anti-social uh, sentiment to this, and in the lyrics as well. Because the lyrics are again hilarious, and really kind of very very out there, and I'd imagine would have really upset some people at the time. Which is exactly what he would have wanted, I'm sure. Um, and like you said, truly experimental, truly experimental music.
To its course element, in my opinion. Because and I think because like the sense of humor is there, you're able to just kind of appreciate the instrumentation without feeling like there's like a dark narrative. And
Yeah,
I think that's like what was interesting to me about it, because like obviously my introduction into experimental music, well, not only just current 93, but just like bands like I've mentioned in the past, like Death Grips was like, on the hip hop spectrum was like how I got into realizing that, oh, there's a form of music where it's like it's not really a sound, but it's more of an attitude. Same way
yep.
punk is like an attitude. Like anyone can be a punk artist or an experimental artist, but it's just more about the attitude, how you go about these certain genres or subgenres that have already been established and like kind of deconstructing it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like, you could say this about Throbbing Gristle that, or any of the artists that we've kind of delved into so far, and the bands that are grouped in the England's Hidden Reverse book, that I think a lot of it maybe, a lot of it is, it's very easy to intellectualize this stuff and to try and, air quotes, understand it. Um, and I think Jim Thirlwell and Foetus is a great antidote to that because you do get the feeling that he is doing this purely to do it. Um, and
And
you get the sense of humor and lightness that you don't get from a current 93 or a Nurse with Wound.
exactly. And also knowing that like on my research of like discovering Foetus and like before we did this video when I was like going through their albums, I realized like, oh, Jim did some stuff. He did a lot of like the soundtracks on Venture Bros,
Yeah,
which like now that I have that as a reference, I'm like, all right, I think I get his music a little bit more because like I grew up like watching Adult Swim like every
yep.
Friday whenever I was able to like get away from my parents' house and go to my grandma's house because she would let me watch that. And based on the humor of Venture Bros and just kind of just the humor of Adult Swim and that type of like mental like uh ethos of like a time period, I guess. I don't know what I'm saying exactly, but like more of just the fact that like that attitude, I can see, okay, that's where that's coming from. Gotcha.
It's funny though, isn't it? Because I think when you actually look at what Jim has done, subsequently, and you mentioned Venture Bros, he's done string arrangements for numerous things. He's worked with a lot of contemporary artists as well. One of my favorite contemporary artists, Zola Jesus. He's worked with her a couple of times, and he's done a lot that I think if you were to just hear certainly the first couple of Foetus albums, you would kind of go, really? Um, because you could be forgiven for thinking, does this guy even like music at all? I'm not sure he does. But listening to these records again, it's been brilliant because it's a great antidote to, um, you know, these records almost exist for the sake of existing. Um, and I really love that about them. And I think Ache, the second record, I don't know what you've got in your notes for this, but it felt to me like it could have almost come from the same group of recordings.
Yeah, this one when I had first listened to it, well, the only time I've listened to it, but it felt like he kind of stripped back and kind of
Yep.
got more traditional. Like it's still experimental, but it sounds calmer. Like it sounds
Yeah.
like and I actually am listening to like how I mentioned he's a 80s pop artist that gone mad.
Yeah.
Well, this album sounds like, well, he probably took some medications and just like, chilled it out a bit, but it still kind of has that essence because I can hear more song structures on here
Yes.
that will be like more attuned to like the times of like, what 80s music would have sound like specifically on the pop realm. So like, it felt less like aggressive, less just kind of just yeah, pretty much just stripped back. And
It's. I was just gonna say, to me, it's that yin yang thing with Death, where it feels like they could have been recorded at the same time, but these are the songs, and Death were the kind of you know noise collages, as it were. And obviously, there is still, like you said, there's still noise on this second album. But you get you're starting to get a little bit more of a sense of his ability as a songwriter in
Yeah,
this one.
that's a good way to point it. Like, because I think uh Def kind of just felt like very confusing at first, and
Yep,
just me trying to adjust like what is this sound? And again, like it's him, kind of starting off, with the experimentation for like the overall Fetus catalog and all of its different variations.
yeah,
And I do think that has something to do with it in the essence that like, all right, he kept changing the name. So like when he kept changing the name, does that mean that like he had a different like is that like the is he going off of different motifs? Does he want to
yeah,
bring a certain narrative, even if like there's not a specific narrative? Is like a narrative based off of like the aesthetics of it?
yep,
And so I feel like because I think those two albums are the only ones where he called himself "You Got Fetus on Your Breath,"
yes,
and
that's right.
then and was there any? And then it goes into Hole where he calls it scraping fetus off the wheel. But
That's
we're
right.
still
Yeah.
we're still on Ache. Was there still any other stuff you had? Because like for me, it just like all I can really say from it is like from Death to Ache. It sounds like chaoticness and then calming down from that chaoticness and going back to a more traditional standard, but still kind of having that chaoticness more like leveled out.
It
That's all I can say for it.
Yeah, I mean the thing that is has un kind of remained unwavered throughout these two records is his uh, absolutely uncanny ability with fantastic one-liners in the lyrics, Um, one man's fish is another man's poisson. I really love. I feel I'm stuck in amazement. There are some great lines in here that are kind of so absurd, but have this. There are flashes of brilliance that you really do get a sense of. This guy is clearly a lot more than just a noise merchant, you know, and it's almost as if that first record, when he made Death, it was like the continuation of that teenager in his room making tapes, going, okay, how far can I push this? And then when Ache comes out, it's kind of like he's come out the other side of that, and these songs are starting to emerge. Um, because, like I said, there are some really great song moments on Ache, and I think it's the sound of because he kind of takes from everywhere. Again, there are elements of swing on here and funk, but there are also elements of krautrock. I'm immediately reminded of Can on here and Armadillo 2 as well, two quite important krautrock bands, and even early Tangerine Dream at times actually. Um, but it's completely unfiltered imagination. It's almost like, and this is going to sound a bit perverse, I suppose. It's almost like free jazz, where it's kind of they will start with this germ of an idea, and then go as far away from that as humanly possible, only to bring it back for the last 8 bars, and then bang, it's done. So the bits that most people actually want to hear are the first and last 8 bars, and then everything in between just it goes where it goes. Um, and Trey and I were talking actually before we started recording about um, hip hop and sampling, and people like Kanye West, who is obviously a controversial figure these days, but was really, really pivotal and crucial in bringing older forms of music back into the mainstream by way of the fact that he would sample them for his records. And in a small way, there's kind of a thread through to people like Jim Thirwell and Foetus because he was doing that in a kind of a different way, as if he was almost making fun of the fact that these things existed. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to put some funk in here amongst all the noise. Um,
It's
but
funny you mentioned Kanye because like if there's any Kanye album that I can compare like most this is catalogs to, and please anyone who's hearing me make this comparison, like don't kill me. It's just a vague like being someone into experimental music, I can find these vague elements. but Kanye West's Jesus is like the best thing I can like
Yep.
compare like some of his stuff to because Jesus, like when it first came out and knowing the type of music Kanye was making before then was totally bonkers. He
Yeah.
purposely made the first track of like Yeezus like a song that like I think it was actually produced like helped produced by Daft Punk,
Yeah.
where it's just like that technically shouldn't have been the first song. That should have been someone else on the album. And he explained this in an interview years ago. But he purposely wanted the album to be out of whack mainly just to be like I can do whatever the fuck I want, but also just like kind of messing with those elements of like putting things in places that they feel like they shouldn't be, but like
Yeah.
they still can flow and just like give you this crazy experience that's just like just so just out there, just out
Yeah.
there.
And that is a really punk attitude, and I know that a lot of people will hate us for talking about Kanye in those terms, but that is it. It's the attitude of this is gonna go out because I can. I'm gonna do what the hell I like, um,
Exactly.
and you're not gonna tell me any different.
Yep.
And moving on to Hole, the next album on our list, you get the sense that it's almost as if, and anybody out there who's maybe vaguely familiar with Foetus or Jim Thirlwell, but wants to kind of dive deeper, um, it Hole is a little bit different. This came out in 1984, and don't misunderstand me because this is not this wouldn't have flown on top 40 radio in 1984 by any stretch of the imagination, but you are getting more of a sense of a songwriter coming through here and a bit more thought being put into what he was doing. Um,
Yeah.
and the weirdness is very much still there, but it almost feels like the weirdness is there to support the songs rather than to just be the
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it because like the what I honestly what I called this one was Pulp Fiction on bad acid.
Yeah. I'm really glad you said that because there's a lot of surf influence on this, and
Surf.
obviously, yeah, surf music and
Oh,
blues
okay, okay,
music,
gotcha,
and
gotcha.
and obviously, Pulp Fiction is all about that. Um, so I'm really glad you said that.
Yeah, I was just like because I literally had just woke up this morning. I was like I did not skim through these albums. I got about like an hour before
Yeah,
like literally last minute like just like tidbits. I'm like I'm still in my bed. I just woken up. I'm like all right, I gotta listen to this, give like a good idea of like how to describe it in like a few words. And I'm just like, all right, this I do remember this album sounding a little bit more like realized or something. Like now that
mm,
like we got through two, like now that he's done two albums, this one sounds like a combination of both those albums, I guess, where it's just like there's, not to say there was any specific direction, but it's just,
yeah,
like you said, like the chaoticness is actually supporting the music writing.
yeah,
And I feel like it just continues from that and even into Nail, which is pretty much like what I've realized is like the fan favorite for most people,
yeah,
at least like in the earlier days of like Fetus, and which I can definitely tell because like um we'll still stick with sorry Hole, but like mainly because I do remember watching an interview where Jim was telling someone that Hole and Nail are kind of anonymous with each other because like a hole and then a nail.
yeah,
And so I think those two albums kind of like partner each other in like this evolution of like just the Fetus catalog as like he's bringing these aesthetics into a more like realized version of themselves, and it's just going to continue to like expand from that. And I do feel
yeah,
like some of the best songs are on both Hole and Nail that like from what I can remember. I don't know the names because again, I've only went through each album once. Did not do my due diligence of like being prepared for this video, but it is what it is. But
yeah. I mean, I think there's something to be said for the first two records and Death in particular, like I said, they feel like he was trying to get something out of his system. Um, Whereas Nail and Whole, um, it's kind of like a bit like with Current 93 in a way that the first two or three records have a sound and a very abrasive sound at that. But then, as a result of those albums coming out, it's almost as if, David Tibet kind of would look around and go, well, now what do I do? I've kind of made my point with that. And I kind of wonder with
The
Jim,
purging.
yeah, and I kind of wonder with Jim whether it was a similar kind of thing. Obviously, the sense of humor is there and is there all the way through, but I get the sense that once he for all the send ups, and there are brilliant send ups of the Beach Boys on here with harmony vocals, where the melody is actually really good, and you think if in the right hands that could almost be a pop hit. And so while I think he is satirizing a lot of pop music on here, he does it so well that you do have to wonder if he ever thought, I'm actually pretty good at this.
Most
Because,
definitely.
yeah, because obviously, you've got songs like I'll Meet You in Poland, Baby, which, again, it's chaotic in its way, but you start to get this sense of, again, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it and say that, hey, this is a great album to listen to if you're completely new to industrial music, because it isn't. But there are moments of real songwriting, like pop songwriting brilliance in here, filtered through this fantastic um, sense of adventure and sense of humor that he has. Because again, like these albums kind of defy categorization, and like you said at the top of this, Trey, this really is unfiltered experimental music. There is no other way of describing it, I don't think.
Yeah, because like, you know, the attitude about it really does feel like, you know, very juvenile, not in like a bad way, but
Mm,
like again, he's going about it in like a way where it's just like, I'm just gonna do something and build off of it and just like keep building off of it. And you also gotta
yeah.
take in consideration that he's most likely doing things with other people and
Yes.
other bands at the same time. Because like again, like if he's associated with like Coil, Nurse with Wound, Current 93, and even Nick Cave and the Black Seeds,
Yeah.
where I like now that like because I remember when we were talking about Foetus like the last time we were doing this doing a video, like I had just listened to Nick Cave and the Black Seeds for the first time, the first album, um From
From
Her
Her
to
to
Affinity.
Eternity. Yeah.
Yeah, for her, yeah, From Her to Eternity, and I fucking love that shit. And
Love that record.
I see the similarities in their
Yeah.
sound, where it's just like, okay, I can like if there's any group that makes sense of him being in, or at least like a certain sound of culture, despite the fact he was working with any and everybody,
Yeah.
like Nick Cave and the Black Seeds, or at least like their earlier stuff, is definitely in the same like spectrum as like these Fetus albums.
Yeah, and it is another partnership that's worth bringing up at this point is his partnership with Matt Johnson, who went and still does go under the banner of The, and he released an album called Infected in 1982, 1981, I want to say. Um, and I'm just going to look this up here because it's going to drive me crazy. Yeah, 1981. So, and then he put out an album called Soul Mining in Sorry, no, I'm getting this all wrong. There's going to be somebody in the comments shooting me right now. Burning Blue Soul was the first of the album, 1981. Infected was 86. But yeah, Jim was on Soul Mining, which was 1983, which is probably the best known The album. And Matt Johnson again was a solo artist who collaborated with people and kind of basically wrote and produced the records, sung on them, but asked people to come and, you know, play this or play that. But it was his vehicle kind of thing. and Jim was on a track called Giant, which I think it was Giant, which is kind of credited as being an early dance kind of pioneer in dance music. Um, and so obviously being on these records, he's going to be taking influence from um, the people he's working with, and that really shows on I think whole um, whole and nail. You really get the sense of him. He's not sacrificing his style, but like you said about him working with Nick Cave, uh, he obviously started to realize that he could make. I don't want to use the term credible music because that kind of devalues what he'd done up to that point, and I think it is, although it is hard going, it is really interesting to listen to because it's so imaginative. Um,
And
but
there's some
it,
accessibility to it.
yeah, absolutely. And I think to go on to Nail, which came out in 1985, he was producing music pretty consistently by this point. And I can completely see why this is the one that's held up as the fan favorite. It's my favorite. I know that's a really kind of easy thing to say. It is my favorite of his albums, certainly from this period, because the um the breadth of styles that he encompasses on here is massive, and I think he's really honed this
Sorry.
kind of.
I'm so sorry. Hold on.
That's okay, man.
I was just trying to remind myself that this was, yeah. Sorry. Continue.
No, I was just gonna say. I think we were talking before. Trey and I were talking before we started recording, actually, about people who kind of have this knack for merging genres together, and we were talking about Ghostmain, who's a really, really well-known SoundCloud artist who has this knack for taking black metal and infusing it with hip hop and vice versa. Um, I feel like this is um, where Jim learns how to do that because every genre you could think of is covered on this, and yet it still has that Foetus uh, noise to it. What did you
Yeah,
think
and
of
look,
this one?
um, yeah, going into Nail, like I kind of like because as I was like listening to like each album, like because I think it took me a week to get through the whole entire like at least the five first like albums. I was also just like like literally after a run, I would literally listen to each Fetus album as I took like an hour run, and
Yeah,
then I would probably go somewhere, get some food, and I just like watch interviews of Jim Thirwell just explaining Fetus. And that's kind of like where I was able to get the most substance of understanding like what he was doing during that time
sure.
period. And it was obvious to tell that like Nail was like the fan favorite and just like kind of like I guess like in the early stages, the magnum opus of like, you know, the realization of what the Fetus catalog was going to be. And I
Yeah,
can definitely hear it because like the song that I was just playing by accident, I was just trying to like get a little sound bite just to make sure like that was the actual song. Anything Viva.
yeah,
And to go back to the interview I remember watching of Current 93, Jim and Coil. I remember like this was like the song that they were playing in the introduction of like Jim's specific like interview. And I just remember just being like, all right, this is very droney, very again that isolation that you hear
yeah,
off of Def, but much more, intentional. There was like an
yeah,
intentionality with it because he knew what he was doing. Whereas like with Def, he was just trying to figure out what he was doing. But
yeah,
like with this, it sounds like he knew what he was doing. And I think honestly, like probably anything Viva is like my favorite song, you know, from Fetus, based just bias in the fact that it was the first thing I ever heard from him, just like from that interview.
yeah,
And just kind of just being like, yeah, there's just like I don't know, it's just it feels very monumental, like something like intense is about to happen. Sadly, I can't remember every elements of the song because like
yeah.
Only went through all these albums once, but this stuck with me. It's this song, and I don't know if it was what other song it was. I think it may have been off of Whole, but songs that stick in my mind when I do remember those first initial listens was obviously Anything Viva, and the one song that goes rollin', rollin', rollin',
Yeah,
rollin', rollin'. I'm just like, okay, I like this a lot. Like obviously because like again that absurd, aesthetic that he has, but it's like very intentional, more well thought out, and there's a bounce to it.
yeah, absolutely. And I think the when I think Nail, I don't know because it's not my world, but I do wonder if Nail in particular influenced people like Ministry uh, later because there is this, Nail and the subsequent album, Thor, um, do have a bit more of an accessible sound. There's a great, um, you get the sense that anything goes with this. Um, Pig's Will I love because there's a darkness to this album too because it moves from satirizing and making fun to talking about uh, there are references to Charles Manson in here, and again, Pig's Will has this sort of murder ballad thing to it. That again, you mentioned Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds before, that he will have picked up from his time with them. And I know actually that there is a there's a diss track against Nick Cave on, I don't know if it's this or one of the other early albums. So I know they did have a falling out at one time.
Oh, dang.
Um, but the Throne of Agony I really like as well. I really love the sort of Iggy Pop vocal delivery on that one. Because that's the other thing as well that I'm by no means an expert on Foetus, and to be honest with you, a bit like Trey, they were a name. Foetus was a name that I knew but didn't know a lot about, and so when we kind of agreed to do the Foetus video, I kind of thought this is a good opportunity for me to reacquaint myself because I think having heard all the albums again, I have listened to all of them, but I'd probably not given them the time that I had to Current 93, for example. So it's been really fun doing this again. Um, and yeah, Pig's Will, I really love. There's this kind of industrial clanging running through it and, almost metallic chords in there, but there's a great riff in it. Um, and again, you get the sense that he's starting to find a way of kind of mashing all these things together without it feeling uh, completely chaotic for the sake of being chaotic. Um, and actually, when you move into Thor, which he moves on in terms of the name, it's Fetus Interruptus, and I believe the only time he uses that
Yeah.
name. Um, it's almost as if he's distilled it again. You know?
Yeah. And I'll be completely honest with you, like I think objectively Nail is definitely like the best work when it comes to, Fetus, developing their sound into
Yeah,
like a very specific tone. But for me, Thaw actually is my favorite because
yeah,
mainly I think because it's the closest to sounding more industrial and more experimental, like on a Current 93 or
yes,
Nurse with Wound type of element where it's just like, all right, I don't hear that much humor that much anymore. And like it's
no,
very aggressive and very just like the instrumentations just seem more violent. And
yeah,
I kind of just like edgy shit. So
yeah,
like it's just kind of a certain bias with me where I'm like,
yeah,
this now if there's an if because like the other four projects, it's just like he's working stuff out, it's
yeah,
coming into form. Now he's ready to like strike. If anything, this is I feel like you got, uh, yeah, sorry. You have hole and then nail, and then this is like striking it
yeah.
with thaw.
I agree completely. I agree completely. Like I say, Nail is my favorite, but Thor is probably my second favorite. And I think you've absolutely, if you'll pardon the pun, hit the nail on the head because, um, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's as if he's kind of worked out that he can put fairly, he can structure songs, and so he's gone. Well, why don't I just try and do that? Um, and that's Thor. Now, I mean, there are parts of Thor that are almost, again, almost unlistenable. You know,
Yeah.
Asbestos, I think, being the obvious one. But then you've got Don't Hide It, Provide It, which is um, a great, great song. It's got that kind of mutant disco element to it. And like you said, it's a far less humor-driven album, much darker, and it's almost as if doing away with the humor has given him more focus because, like I said, Nail's my favorite, but I think in terms of if there was one record that he's done under the Foetus name that is just, you can put it on and it sounds like one vision distilled into
Yeah.
a single record, it's this one.
I feel like this one is like it's the one album where I feel like I can actually just experience the album for what it is
Yeah,
instead of having to decipher, you know, I guess not decipher, but just kind of like pinpoint certain elements of like sounds that are just like
yeah,
interesting in all of his other albums because it's just like you're just trying to figure out like what's going on. He like this book of songs have this book of songs have that book of songs have this. But with Thaw, it's just like, all right, fully realize this is it all the way straight through. You're just like, oh wow. Like I
yeah,
guess like to the best of my degree of like anything I can compare this to, not style wise, but just like the journey of going through this album gives me the same journey of when I first like had listened to King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard album or something.
yeah,
It's just
yeah,
where it's just like it's just consistent, no breaks, just like this, that.
yeah. So what a great band to mention in a discussion about Foetus, because there is a band who push the boundaries of genre. I mean, I can't think. They're my cousin's favorite band, actually, and every album they've ever released, of the hundreds of albums they have released, is different from the last one, and it's that same approach of,
Yeah.
you know, it. I have to wonder, listening to Thor again, because I listened to it this morning, actually. You have to wonder when you hear this what he could have done and how successful he could have been if he'd just written pop music. Because his capabilities as a songwriter are clearly
They're
great.
there.
Like, they are there, and he, I think Foetus, the whole point of it, really for me was to kind of be, certainly when he started, was to be obtuse and to antagonize the listener. Um, Whereas when you get to Thor, he just proves that he can write with the best of them. And like I say, yeah, there are elements on this album that are equally as kind of antagonistic as things on Death, for example. But you really get his brilliance, I think, as a composer and as a producer by the time you get to Thor. Because
Yeah.
again, he's still basically doing everything here. Um, and like I said, another thing we were talking about before we started recording. Trey and I, this is the first time Trey and I have spoken to each other since the last video, which was a while ago, so we were having a good catch up before this. But we were talking about how successful uh, an artist can be with good branding, and Foetus had fantastic branding all the way through. Like listening to these records again and looking at the sleeves,
Yeah, the album covers are awesome.
they're awesome, and they're all so immediately identifiable. They're all different, but they all follow that artistic trend, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and like I say, it's almost like he had all the right ingredients to actually be quite a popular songwriter. But he didn't want to do that, and yeah, big respect. I think this is the album where you kind of go, he's just throwing out this brilliant um, piece of twisted pop music,
Yep.
just because he can.
Yeah. And honestly, like again, I'm gonna have to definitely get back into listening to them and honestly
Yeah,
back into listening to like, these sectors of artists that like we've been discussing, on this channel and like through our videos because I definitely fell off a little bit, but
mm.
a lot of just a lot of stuff has just been going on like in a good way. It's just
Yeah, yeah,
my attention is just like I feel like in spite of like the pandemic and just stuff that's just been going on in the world, I'm just at a point where I'm like, yeah, I just kind of want to be happy again. I've been feeling great. I've been music has I feel like has been on a good rise lately in
yeah,
all of its respective genres, and I kind of just want to like, I'll still be aware of what's happening in the world, but it's just like I can't really live my life just like being worried of like what's about to happen in the world today, what's about to
yeah,
happen
yeah,
here. It's just like, and now that I got certain stuff established in my personal life, I can really kind of call back to just being able to like revisit like a certain energy that I used to have when I was
yeah.
younger and actually
Absolutely.
delve into like these delve into music as a whole without having all these like personal insecurities or restrictions because like I've officially established the things that I want to do, and like now
Yeah,
it's just like it's time to build it because we only have so much time. Because
yeah,
like I feel
absolutely.
bad that in the fact that I'm like it took us three months to like I mean you were busy, I was busy, but it's just like 3 months of before we made this video, and I literally did not listen to like all these albums like thoroughly, and I just like
Yeah,
I'm like it's like this part of me that feels bad, but I'm just like I'm like all right, I really want like our videos just kind of be like a home ground where it's just like we can just put all the other bullshit away like that's
yep,
going on in our lives and just
yep.
like talk about our passion and music, and I do feel
Absolutely.
like these bands really embody exactly how we see music, but also we see the world through an artistic lens, and I just
Yeah,
want to be able to give them light, especially due to the fact that a lot of these bands have not really been recognized over the years despite them being around for this long and still continue to do stuff. And I feel like a part of it is like this is like a certain element of art history in its purest form.
absolutely. And I think actually, Foetus is uh, a great one to talk about because it shows that you can you can do anything you want with music. And I think some of us, myself included, it must be said, get trapped in um, convention where
Yeah.
you feel like, oh no, I can't do that. But of course you can. You can do anything you want. Um, and Thesis and Jim Thirlwell, and listening to these records again, it shows that I think how far imagination can take you. Because he he's able to write these fantastic little um, pop vignettes within all this chaos that he's creating. Um, and it's worth saying as well, Whole Nail and Thor all reached the upper reaches of the indie charts here in the UK. And back then, when that meant something, that meant selling sort of tens of thousands of records. So
Mm.
he was really beginning to establish himself. Um, but then, in true Thirlwell Foetus style, you then didn't hear anything from Foetus for 7 years. There was a couple of live bootleg albums that came out. One of which I've got, Rife, which was recorded on the tour for Thor, which isn't very good. It must be said, it's very poorly recorded. But then it's a bootleg, so that's to be expected. But he went and did other things in the interim. Wise Blood being one which he released an album called Dirt Dish under the Wise Blood name in 1986, which is really explosive again, and savage lyrics throughout that. Um, Not as full frontally assaulting as the early Foetus, but more distorted guitar, and he's working with different people on there as well. He's got a lot of collaborators kind of um, coming in on that one. I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to that yet, but if you haven't, I can recommend it.
Yeah, I need to probably have like all of the different bands and names that he's been under because like even with Fetus having all their different names, I'm just like, yeah, he's literally been everywhere. So
He
like
has, yeah. He's done so many things. And like I said, when I'd actually forgotten about that, I'd forgotten that he kind of abandoned the Fetus name for quite a while. Um, it wasn't
I
until 1995 that he put the next Fetus album out,
think it's called
um,
Gash.
Gash,
Yeah.
which in the UK can mean a couple of things. One of which, and I don't know if this is, I'm assuming, I don't think this is probably why he called it this. Maybe he did, but it's one of the more awful names for the female anatomy in the UK.
Oh,
Um,
gotcha.
and maybe he did with the name Fetus attached to it. Maybe he did call it that and mean it that way. But yeah, I had not listened to this for quite a long time. Um, I'd be interested to see what you thought of this one.
Oh, I'll be honest, like, so I only got through the first five albums. I have not gotten to Gash, Flow, Love, Vain, Hide, or so. I just did five.
Well, what I'll say is, I think rather than me talk about Gash and then we'll kind of, you know, I think maybe what we ought to do is do a part two because like I said, I've not listened to this album in a long time, and the later Foetus records, a couple of them I don't think Hide from 2010. I actually don't think I'd heard that before. So yeah, I think maybe what we ought to do is do a separate video on those when we've both had more time to absorb them. Um,
Yeah, because I definitely need to do that for like the first five because because I was liking what I was hearing, but then I just like fell
yeah.
off on like just the consistency of just doing the research and listening.
The
But
interesting thing for me, and I don't know if you found this, given how chaotic the certainly the first two albums are, despite all the chaos and the absurdity and the fact that you never quite know what's coming next, there's a really logical evolution to the first five albums. You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
Death through to Thor. It all kind of, when you listen to them in order, it all makes sense in a strange way.
Yeah, like honestly, and I think, and this is something I have noticed about certain bands that really start from the ground up. Like
Yep.
they have the building blocks, but like as time goes on, even like when it comes to like TV shows, like it really does feel like he wanted to start something, was like, experimenting with it for a while and then just
Yeah.
evolving it. So because like it feels like just like a consistent progression and like even though I haven't listened to uh Gash yet, I really need to like I can only assume that it's really just gonna start going into a even much more focused realm, off of Thaw, I assume.
I
Um
think because of the break he had between releases under the Foetus name, I think Gash, and I don't mean this in a bad way either, but I think it's maybe the first album of his where he has been influenced by people as opposed to the other way around. Because those first five Foetus albums were incredibly influential in industrial music terms. Whereas I think Gash, because of when it came out in 1995, you could tell that he had listened to Ministry. You could tell that he'd listened to Skinny Puppy, and some of those other bands who really were influenced by him in the first place.
it's
Um,
it's funny you mentioned Skinny Puppy because like I can see like some comparison, and because I've only listened to the first Skinny Puppy album maybe like two times, but
Yeah,
just like that gurgling, like that like rough voice type of it's type of sound. And I hear that I was hearing that a lot in like some parts of like, the Fetus catalog, and it was
yeah,
just like, yeah, this is like I see how some of these like artists probably like influence each other in the early stages, because
yeah,
like these are very specific sounds that like I just can't pinpoint. Like, sure, I can easily say it's like, is it being metal? Is it being like that?
yeah,
But it's just like when you've listened to enough out there music and have so many different reference points, you can start seeing and isolating like, okay, this group was doing this specific thing and probably had associations with these groups, and then like they just all kind of merged and then took hiatuses, came back, developed it from like what they were all doing like at different points in their
yeah,
lives. Because it's just like I can see correlations of like tidbits from other groups. Like
yeah,
again, like to mention like when I was making the Nick Cave and Bad Seed comparison, because I'm just like I hear it.
mm,
And I guess for me, as someone who's not, well knowledgeable about all these bands, since like I'm still just starting to get into them and
yeah,
only have very few reference points, like I still am able to recognize what the energy of like a collective of certain artists are doing at certain time periods and waves, and
yeah.
like what that probably meant during those times.
Yeah, and I think the other thing as well is I've just been looking at the discography here. He had a couple of EPs and singles going along with these releases that were
Hmm.
different. And he also there were a couple of compilations that came out. Sync, which came out in 1989, was a compilation of kind of rare and unreleased stuff that covers basically that whole early period. Um, so that I wonder if when we kick off, because I've not listened to that, so I wonder if when we do our second video, maybe we ought to start by listening to Sync and then go on to the rest of the albums, because there's a lot of stuff on here that was recorded around the time of the other, the early releases that we've been talking about, but weren't included, and I've not heard them, so that could be a good place to start.
Yeah, let's do that. I like that idea.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it sounds to me like we've got another episode to do for this because
Yep,
yeah, I'd like to give the later stuff its due because I've not heard it enough really. Um
exactly. And
and I
same thing. And sorry.
No, I was just gonna say it's been really fun listening to the first few albums again because it does make you really appreciate the he was it wasn't just noise for the sake of it, like he was genuinely a really talented guy, and I think um he was being deliberately provocative and antagonistic, but eventually when you get to Nail and Thor especially, he couldn't hide behind that anymore. His real talent for songwriting just came through.
Yeah, and like, because honestly, I like when I listen to the music, even just like looking at the album covers alone, like I
Yeah.
really do feel like I'm in his space.
Yep.
That's specifically him. Yes, he has influences from other people, but like this does feel specifically like its own
Yep.
thing and something that has been nurtured and crafted. And like, yeah, once we get to like, some of the later albums that, have came out in like recent times, I'm curious of seeing like how that evolution like actually came into play.
Yeah.
And and what I was gonna mention was like, I feel like, not anytime soon, but like in the future, I would like to also do that with like Current 93, just to like
Absolutely.
probably if you want to do it for like the anniversary of a first Current 93 video, that'd be
That'd be
dope.
great.
Like
Yeah,
just
that'd be
like
great.
specifically everything from like the 2000s, because I really haven't given them their due diligence as much as I did like the
Yeah,
80s and 90s stuff.
and actually, thinking back to when we did the current 93 videos, particularly the first two that we did, I know we went into a lot of depth on the early albums. And while I would obviously we're kind of veering from topic here, but while I would probably still put if A City Set Upon a Hill, which came out a couple of years ago, I would probably still put that in my top 5 current 93 albums. The rest of the kind of 2000s stuff, I am less familiar with, insofar as I've heard Nature Unveiled hundreds of times, but I haven't listened to the others as much. I love them, and I like, I kind of, I'm familiar enough with them to kind of go, oh yeah, this is that song. Um, no, I'd be really up for that. And I think, like you said about when you listen to these Foetus albums, you feel like you're in his space, and I really agree with that because, like we were saying about the artwork before, he's managed to do something quite unique insofar as he's taken what is really quite a punk trope of having a kind of uh, collage artwork that looks like some totalitarian regime propaganda poster.
Yeah.
And yet, he's managed to do it in such a way that it is immediately identifiable as him,
Yep.
which is really hard to do. Um,
And being like an art student and going to like an art design like school, it's just
yeah,
like just looking at these album covers, I'm like, this is good graphic design work. It's
yeah,
just how everything is structured.
yeah, absolutely. And I think he he really seemed to understand the value of that. Um, that it wasn't just about the music um, or the recorded part of it. It was about the visual as well, and you do get that. And there are lots of bands that do this, but obviously we're talking about Foetus and Jim Thirlwell now. But you listen to those first 5 albums, as we've been doing, and like you said, you're in his world. Um, and I took them in the car with me today, actually. When I was driving, I dropped my partner off at a train station in town earlier on today, and they just you put them all next to each other, and they just look fantastic together, and you kind of get the sense that you're about to go on an adventure,
Yeah,
um,
exactly. Yep.
which all the best artists do. All the best artists. You mentioned Kanye before has great branding. Iron Maiden is a classic example of that,
Oh,
where
yep.
you know every album kind of has a through line to the next one and it has an identifiable logo and an identifiable look. And I think all the smartest artists really understand that. I think that
The
it
consistency of it.
yeah, it builds a narrative that is greater than the recorded part of the discography, and I think um, that's that's all part of the fun of it for me.
Yeah, it's like you're listening to like a Sonic comic book or something,
Absolutely,
especially based on
absolutely.
like, the aesthetics from like the first album Def like because I remember like when I was like trying to find like these albums on Spotify, like obviously like when it comes to these artists, these niche artists that we're into, like a good majority of their stuff is definitely going to be on Spotify, but some stuff are not. So like I had to
Yeah,
go on YouTube to listen to the Def album, and it was just like, oh, okay, I can see like because even like looking at it, I could tell how primitive of like the
yeah,
idea of Fetus was actually going to be because it's just like it's just like a random comic strip, like edit it a little bit, but for the
yeah,
most part, I'm like, yeah, this definitely seems like, the building block and just
yeah. And
from all the
it's interesting that you say building block as well, because he really seemed to grow up in public, because it's like you said, that first sleeve for Death is very much an existing image that he's tweaked a little bit. But he obviously took from that, the color scheme, for example,
yeah,
has kind of stayed all the way through. Um, and it was like he kind of took that and just started to upgrade it each time and add his own flavor to it. But really and truly, from the second record onwards, there was that there was that aesthetic. Um, yeah, really, it's been really good fun going through these again, and they are fun as much as they are abrasive to listen to. Because, like I said, he had that great humor all the way through there, and I think um, in a different world, I think he could have been
A
quite.
big pop artist.
Yeah, I do think that. And actually, until we started listening to these records again, I maybe hadn't given him the credit for how good a songwriter he was. Um, because it was almost like he had so much going on in his head and threw all these different genres into the mix. Um, I suppose it kind of speaks to the sound of the records as well, doesn't it? If you put enough stuff in a blender, it's going to make a horrible noise.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. That is a good point. Yeah.
right? So it's like, well, what if I take Oriental music and jazz and classical and electro and rock and put all of this in, and it's like sometimes it works and it works incredibly well, and sometimes you're just going to get a horrible noise. Like we mentioned asbestos on Thor, which is just 3 minutes of violin screeching,
Yeah,
um, almost to remind you of what you're listening to. Uh,
pretty much. And it's like this is still noise, experimental music.
but yeah,
Like,
no, it's been great, and I think doing these videos since we've started kind of collaborating on these videos over the last sort of 7 or 8 months, however long it's been. Um, it's a really, like you said earlier, it's a really good space to talk about artists who I think Trey and I both feel deserve to be remembered because obviously they're on YouTube, they're on Spotify, but that doesn't mean anybody is looking at them in any degree of depth.
exactly.
Um,
And I think having these types of videos, especially just like knowing how much history that they have and being involved in other stuff, like I'm
mm,
pretty sure even the mentioning of like, for example, say that like someone who's not even used to listening to experimental music, happens to see this Fetus video, probably because they liked another video like unrelated to, this realm of music that I've made over the years, and happens to hear me say like, yeah, they like Jim did like soundtracks for Venture Bros. And
yeah.
then people, and that's gonna spark up like a realization of like, oh, I really like Venture Bros. Let me like
Mm,
take a look into this dude's music. And then they probably like the music on Venture Bros. So they probably want to like, dive deep into that based on like, for nostalgic purposes and the fact that like, I never knew that this dude was doing all this type of stuff because like when you like, especially like with someone like him doing so many things, like it's hard for people to have one attune attention even
yeah,
specifically to his own projects. And I think especially like when you're making niche type of stuff like that, like it's not going to reach the masses, but like I think having detailed like history actually expounded upon like whether it's through audio or video, is going to help people
yeah,
realize that oh, there's a lot of geniuses that, are out there that don't necessarily have to be like on a Kanye level of like, notoriety that like you realize have actually been influencing you your whole entire life and you just don't know it.
absolutely. And I think Jim Thirlwell is one of those people. I think it takes a real degree of daring and um, confidence to do this. I people might look at something like Death, the first record, or even something like Nature Unveiled by Current 93, or the first Throbbing Gristle record, or any of these artists, and think anyone can do that, that's just noise. But anyone can't do that because you have to have a phenomenal amount of belief in what you're doing to see this kind of thing through, I think.
Yeah. Like, and you have to like keep pushing away the naysayers and just really, really stick with like a vision that you really want to happen, especially if you know that like you've been influenced by other artists who have done it in the
Yeah,
past. And it's just like, well, you got to keep that same energy. Like, I do feel like there's certain forms of artistic expression that, while, yeah, it's not going to be as recognized, it builds some of the great bases for like other music that is well recognized. And I do feel like having like a consistent stream of like, you know, pushing the boundaries as like time goes on, as life evolves, things, get chaotic and then they come into order. But then once
Yeah.
there's too much order, it's just like, all right, we need to do something different. We need to keep evolving this. And I mean, honestly, that's just human nature in general,
Yeah, and I
like
think
the evolution.
that's a really nice way to kind of round out the video, I think, because to go back to what I said at the beginning about Jim's quote of punk being the Big Bang, what came after being the expansion of the universe, it's exactly like you've just said that eventually too much order requires there's a boiling point, isn't there, where a schism where things spill over. Punk happened and showed the world that music could be made by anybody, and that no one's gonna no one's gonna give you anything. So get out there and do it yourself, and you can do that, and you can be a novice musician, but still be in a band and make music. And but then punk, as great as the attitude was of that, punk music 76, 77 was quite, for the most part, kind of old fashioned, you know? We'd heard guitar chords before, we'd heard um, that kind of basic three chord rock before, going back to the Kinks and the Beatles, you know. That wasn't anything new, but the attitude was. But then when you get to bands like Foetus, and you get to bands like um, let me think of another. So on the on the sort of true post punk side, you had people like Joy Division, who again they took a formula that already existed and spun it. But you get to bands like Foetus, and you think, well, this is completely new. This has never happened before, really. And there are touch points, and there are references, and there are um, the parts of songs where he's clearly parodying the Beach Boys, for example, like I mentioned earlier, or Elvis. But the idea to take all those elements, put all this kitchen sink noise to it, and yet still somehow have the thread of a song in there, made by one person in the early days, that was pretty revolutionary in its small way for the time. And like you
Yep.
said, you the great thing about doing videos like this is that it makes you realize that many of these artists are just sort of quietly working away on the fringes of the music industry,
The
quietly,
society as a whole, to be
yeah,
honest.
quietly influencing everything that came after them, really. Um, in the case of Jim Thirlwell, like you mentioned with Skinny Puppy earlier on, these records were so influential on the industrial artists, as were other, um, it's by the Neubauten and other industrial artists, Robin Gristle as well. But yeah, the idea of
Toil.
yeah, and the idea of one or two people doing all of this themselves, um, I think for this time was basically unheard of. Um, and that's yeah, I think that's true punk in a way. And like you said, it sort of eventually that things come into order and then they splinter off again. As is the case with this. I mean, we ended on Thor, which is the most ordered of the 5 albums he put out back then. Um, and yeah, it's been really great visiting these again. So I'm looking forward to doing a part two.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna plan to try to visit the first 5 albums again just to like
Yeah,
cement that in my head properly
yeah, I
and
think I'll
then
do the
be able to
same.
go on because like I think because I think also what it is too is that like my brain had to like kind of readjust itself and like not try to listen to this as a into current 93 or coil because
Yep,
like they kind of delve in a very specific subject matter that I'm just naturally used to when it comes to
yep,
like the occult. And I realized like with this like I'm just like listening to a guy who's just like making a lot of interesting chaotic stuff, and like there's not really any in-depthness to
Yep.
like sink me in. So it's just like I have to listen to this like very aesthetically, but then I kind of get like worried if like am I not embracing it enough, or am I not like doing enough research where it's just like I don't really think I mean, of course, like I can still do research and he still
Yeah.
has like other things. It's just like again, it's like when a lot of this spawned from Current 93, I was doing so much digging. So like it's like my higher intellectual self was like, all right, we got to go into this. We got to make sure we know each year all the lyrics, and I realized like I don't really think I need to know the lyrics specifically because they still go on like this typical 80s tropes, but he's just a madman.
Yeah.
It's just like, and it's just like, all right, just kind of sit back and enjoy the aesthetic of it instead of like if there's any meaning behind it,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. And I think he really hits on it's where David Tibet's intelligence comes from his ability to convey his battle with religion, for example. Jim's intelligence comes from the fact that he is able to create brilliant pop melodies within a chaotic industrial environment. But he also writes incredibly wittily. You know, you could to the point that some of the English listeners in particular, I think, will get where I'm coming from on this. His lyrics kind of draw comparison to Monty Python, or
Oh yeah, yeah, I
you
like
know
Monty
that
Python.
whole kind of absurd English, and writers like Lewis Carroll as well, who did Alice in Wonderland. You know, that kind of
Yeah.
Dada absurdist thing. Um, and I think I love kind of the. I feel like Jim and David are almost two sides of the same coin in terms of um, how quietly influential they've been and how clearly brilliant they are, but in completely different ways. Um, Even though on the surface of it, to the average listener, you could probably say that the first couple of Foetus albums and the first couple of Current 93 albums are almost interchangeable because it's just, oh my god, that's noise, get it away from me,
Exactly.
you know?
Yeah, and I think in to send this video off, I would say I think Jim and pretty much anything like Fetus and people associated with each other in this realm of like making this type of music, like the
Yeah,
more that I research it, the more it just kind of inspires me to like you know help influence my art and my
yeah,
way of thinking in general, not even just art but just like the way that you approach the world, because I do
yeah,
feel like your life in itself is an art. And so if you can get it through visual arts, music, a lot these people they have like a passion, they have a
yeah,
craft, and they're willing to stick with it no matter what the
absolutely.
pushback is. And I think the reason and again, to go back to Current 93, the reason why I gravitated towards that music is because like I saw the dedication
Yeah,
just based off like the amount of albums that they had
yeah,
over decades. Like that is true lifelong commitment. And again, not to say other mainstream artists haven't done that if they've been around for a while, but there is something about like when you're getting art from someone who's really like just working on this for themselves,
yeah,
without probably barely any recognition, and if there is, it's just very niche. But knowing that that loyalty and that like fan base is there and it will always stick with you,
mm,
I think means like honestly the most to me, like as an artist, is that like you just the you have so much quantity with quality, but like but you realize that like you really want good quality stuff
yeah,
and good
absolutely.
quality experiences for other people to experience and for us to engage, because like it brings a certain type of mindset of like creativity to allow everybody just to actually figure out like put meaning in our human life that like is
Yeah,
very limited. And I feel
absolutely.
like this feels more worthwhile than like trying to achieve like, the what I would call like the American dream, which in my
Yeah,
head and like nowadays is dead. But like
yeah,
at the same time, it's just like, yeah, the industry, the mainstream media, like while there's nothing wrong with that, it's just like I feel like the best gift that you can give yourself is like what's already within. And I feel like this
absolutely.
is what
And
people like him are doing.
learning to let go as well, because
Yep.
I think the one thing you could say about those Foetus albums is there is no there's no kind of self consciousness with them. They are made completely freely because you can't make a record like Death, for example, if you're second guessing yourself all the time.
Yep.
And I think that's yeah, learning to kind of trust your initial judgment
Yep.
and kind of just follow your kind of artistic vision, like you said, just quietly doing your own thing and not sort of caring too much about what's going on in the outside world. I think you can't go far wrong in that. Because then you're always just going to sound like yourself.
Exactly. Trust your gut.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. And I think we'll end it off on there, guys. Jonathan, as always, thank you for doing these videos with me.
Pleasure, mate.
Each
Pleasure.
time I feel like I'm just like realizing something new about like music, arts, and just life in general. And like it just makes me feel more secure to like always like keep pushing like more videos out with good quality in them.
Yeah.
And I just think again, I will always say this in every video. Thank you for being part of this with me.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. And long may it continue because I really do enjoy doing these.
Sweet. All right, guys. You guys have a nice day, and we are out.
We are out. Take care, everybody.